Welcome to This Week from the Principal's Desk, a podcast about Christian schools and their leadership. This podcast is hosted by two Christian school leaders. My name is Rob Lunak, and I'm the superintendent of Lutheran Neighborhood Schools in Milwaukee, Wisconsin.
My name is Mike Sheeman. I'm the principal at Bethany Lutheran School in Parma, Ohio. And today, Rob and I are going to talk a little bit about a topic that might on the surface seem kind of dry, but at the same time, we can't underestimate the importance of what we're going to discuss. And today, we're going to be talking a lot about developing policy. Now, I'm sure people are not listening thinking, oh, that's great. I can't wait to go write policy. It's my favorite thing to do. Yet at the same time, it's a gift from God that we can put policies in place that enable us to fulfill his ministry and protect us as we do as we do it, also protecting the students, protecting the parents, and making sure that things really happen in an orderly way, because that's how God designed our world. God designed our world to be an orderly place. And so what we're going to dive into a little bit today is taking a look at what kind of policies should we be writing? How do we do that? How do you update them? Where do you get templates and copies of policies? How do we make sure we're legally sound? All those good things, with the hopes that it just creates a little bit of thoughts in your head. Maybe you'll reflect on your own policies, what your school has, and you'll get a chance just to review those and make sure that you're comfortable in executing them and knowledgeable in how this all works. So, Rob, why don't you kick us off and talk a little bit about maybe just the whole thing about what is policy and how does that sometimes get procedurally muddy, and how can we maybe differentiate between the two?
Yeah, I don't know anybody that loves school policy. I think we love that we have them. I think we love when they work. I think nobody likes writing them, and I think nobody likes generally having to use them because you have policies for when things don't work the way you expected them to. That's what it is. They're kind of curbs and guidelines, right? But these are more hard and fast than like the set of rules for whatever pirates from that Johnny Depp movie, right?
There you go.
More concrete than that. And you need them to protect your school and to give order to your operation and to make sure that everyone knows what is expected of who in what situations. And where I think a lot of schools run aground here is that they will have policies for things that don't need to have policies around them, but maybe they need procedures around them. And Mike, me and you were talking about this before we hit record here, is
Mhm.
that your set of policies should be the big high level things, and then the individual little bits of things like how exactly we do this or how exactly we do this thing, you might have a procedure for that thing. So policies around student safety, policies around how you handle your money, policies around what your building gets used for. Like those are all good high level policies to have, but then you need procedures within all that. Procedures for how do you actually collect tuition, procedures for how do you actually dismiss from school, procedures for how do you actually do a fire drill. And you don't need to make sure, you don't need to think those are the two and the same because they're not, but do need to look at them and say, okay, do we know what is expected here? And do we have a policy that gives us the freedom to act in the way we would want to, while also protecting us if something were to go sideways? Think of it like when you go to an amusement park and they make you sign that waiver. They've kind of worded it in such a way where, the roller coaster could go flying off the track and they go, oh, too bad, you've signed a waiver.
Mhm.
Now, you have a great argument, I think, for negligence if your roller coaster flies off the track there. So don't think it covers everything, but you want your policies to really cover the big, thorny, common issues. You're not going to be able to have them for everything, and you will never be done writing policy. That's something I think we should talk about at the top. You will always have new policies to write because there will always be new things. For example, how many people in the last year or two had to write a policy or a procedure around AI? Didn't have to do that before. Now you do. And before that, it was how to use Chromebooks or laptops. And before that, it was, okay, here's our internet use. And before that, it was, here's what we're going to do when kids have phones now. So there's all these little things that will continually add policies or procedures to your building. And so that's the big high level. And now we're going to go into more of the detail on how you write them, what should be in them, how you revise them. That's going to be really the topic today.
Yeah. Yeah, and it was interesting. There was one school, Rob, where I took a call and I landed in at my new school and I asked them to see their policy manual. And when they brought it to me, it was like 186 pages long. And I went, okay, we have a problem here. And when I looked through it, what was included in this policy manual were things like job descriptions, a field trip permission form, a form for the staff to fill out to request professional development money. Like it was all there in what they called their policy manual. Now, having those things in and of themselves is great. In fact, I encourage you to make sure you have updated job descriptions and forms and all that kind of stuff, but it doesn't belong in your policy manual. The policy, the way I've always spoken about it, is that basically the policy builds the sandbox in which the principal gets to play. So your policy could simply say, yeah, like you said earlier, we charge tuition. We're a tuition-based school. Now, the procedure that you're going to have to develop from that is, well, how much tuition do you want to charge? I mean, policy could even say charging tuition in a way to ensure sustainability. You could say something to that level. But then that gives you guidelines. You're going to make sure that your tuition is sustainable. So you're not charging $5 a kid for tuition when the actual cost is $10,000. Like that, just making sure you're good. And then how do you collect tuition? How do you deal with accounts in arrears? What kind of tuition payment plans? What's your collection method? All that is not part of the policy. Now, in order to fulfill the policy, you have to have all those things sorted out, but those types of things are going to land in your parent and student handbook, your faculty handbook. They're going to land in other places. So the policy manual itself is not something that needs to be super long. But what I would encourage people to think about is to say, where do you feel that you need that sandbox to be built? So if you're going to take a look at, let's talk about volunteers for a second, because I've recently updated my volunteer policy. We use parent volunteers. Now, in this particular case, we went ahead and actually included in our policy that for a parent to be eligible to volunteer, we need to have a background check and they need to complete the ministry safe training, because I didn't want to pull that out, even though that's procedural, because I need that to be policy, because you cannot, there's no exceptions to that rule. So what's the sandbox that was built is parents who are going to volunteer need to do ministry safe and background check, no question asked. So I felt that that was a good way, even though it was a little procedural, to add into the policy. But you can do policies on things like field trip policies. You can have budgetary, monetary policies. In fact, one school where I was doing an accreditation, they were struggling because the school was making money year after year, and the church had a deficit year after year. And where did the church go to figure out their deficit? Was the school's funds, but some of that money was from the government. So the school was really frustrated. So we worked together through this accreditation to develop a surplus funds use policy to say, if there is excess funds at the end of the year in the school account, this is how it's going to be used. Now that makes sense because you're working to direct something that is rather specific and making sure that everybody's on board. And then when it comes up at the end of the year, we can't say, how do we use this money? Let's shell it away, or let's put it to the church, to the offering plate. What does our policy say about that? It says we have to do this. And that's also a yellow flag, though, in policy, is that you don't want policy to micromanage. You want it to enable ministry and make sure that there's clarity in what people are doing in these areas. So that was a really long, big dump of information, but I think it's something that it's things that I've had to go through recently, just that are at the top of my head right now.
Yeah, one of the things with policy is you will encounter situations where you don't have one, and I want to encourage you to take a minute and instead of saying, well, this just happened, we need to write a policy right now, give it some time before you do that, because here's why. The situation is past, your policy is not going to help you with what just happened. It won't. You didn't have the policy then, you had to deal with the situation then. Policy is not retroactive. And if you make a policy right after something happens, you're going to make it for that exact situation, and then it's not going to be useful to you unless that exact situation happens exactly that same way all the time. But it probably doesn't, because unfortunately, our lives are not that simple. School is complicated. Things don't always go the same way. So if something happens that you realize you need a policy for, take the time to write a good one, and a good one that is broad enough to be helpful to you and narrow enough to protect you. Because if you make one too narrow, you won't actually be able to use any of your professional judgment, and you are not a robot. You need your professional judgment. And if you make one too broad, well, then it won't give you any guidance on what you should be doing. So you want to find that sweet spot between something that gives you enough detail, but also gives you enough room. The second thing with policy and procedure is now that we've given some time to write something when something happened, you do need to review them before you need them once you have them. So you've written it. You haven't had to use it in a year. You should still review it. And if you have a lot of policies or a lot of procedures, maybe you need to put those on a schedule. We're going to review these this year. We're going to review these this next year. But you want to review them because things change. That's just life. Things are always different with our schools. We could have lots of changes to our ministry. Maybe you had a policy for building use, but now you have a different building with different needs. Or maybe you have a second building now. And how do you build that in? And is your policy account for that? Are you protected in all of those things? And so you want to review it, because if you're only reviewing it after something went terribly wrong, then it probably wasn't super useful for you. And think of policy like a playbook for a sports team. You want to review the playbook pretty regularly, because that's how you're going to execute your game plan. And that's the same way for schools. We're going to use our policies and our procedures to execute our plans. And that means we need to know what is in them, and we need to know what they say, and we need to know how we can use them. One of my favorite things that I always like to do with school boards is take a policy and take a really thorny one, like dress code. Take a really thorny one. And before anything comes up, go to your school board and be like, hey, let's talk hypotheticals. What about this, this, this? And lay those things out, and then talk through and find all those little gaps. You want to test the fences on your policy first on your own before somebody else tests them for you, because people will test them for you. This is just how it's going to go. There will be things that come up and you go, man, why didn't we think about that? Well, because you can't think of everything. But if you can think of some of those things and get some of those things out of the way and cleared up and ironed out and go, okay, our policy is really vague here. Now we know we need to get this cleaned up. That's going to help you in the long run, because as an administrator, I always wanted to get policy clean enough where I never really needed to worry about it, except during that review time. Or if I needed something, I knew it was solid and I knew I could lean on it.
Yep, exactly. Well, and let's even raise the plane a little bit higher to get a bigger view of this. Rather than just policy, why don't we talk about governing documents? Because the other thing that you want to look at is, if you are writing policy or developing anything, it's quite likely that you have other documents too, like a personnel manual, a constitution and bylaws. You've got handbooks. You've got other things that need to play with the policy. So you can look at developing policy, but it can't be done in isolation. So it's really important to say, if you're going to write a policy on this, does your constitution allow for that? Do other governing documents allow for that? So make sure they play well together. But the other thing too is just coming down to, how do you write it? Like, how do you sit there and say, I'm just going to develop this policy? I would offer a couple of resources to you. It's easy to reach out to your district office and to say, what are some samples of these policies? What do you have that could help me? I'd also encourage you to reach out to other schools that are in your area. They're going to be different than your school, but contextually, they're going to be dealing with a lot of the same things, quite likely. But find out what other schools have as their policies. Contact a couple other principals and say, would you mind sharing your policy manual with me, just to go through it and see even what are the headings. For me, a table of contents is really all I need in a policy manual to say, oh, I think we might need that one. What does that look like? And then the third tool that I would propose is actually quite decent, but you have to use your common sense and your God-given judgment as you use it, is ChatGPT. We have our AI policy here too, but AI wrote it. It's kind of great. I love putting it in there and just saying, write me a policy on this in the context of a Lutheran school, and seeing what it comes up with. Some of them are worthy of pushing the delete key within 30 seconds, and others I'm able to massage and say, wow, this kind of hit the mark. We know ChatGPT draws from all different types of things. So it's, the keywords that are there: Lutheran, policy, Christian, school. It's going to come up with the things that you might need. So if you're struggling to write something, I think it's a really good diving board to get into the pool. So I'd encourage you to have a look at that.
Yeah, the AI thing has made policy, I think, more accessible from a writing perspective, but also from hey, I want a sample really quick. I want to go find something. I want to look at it, because you'll be thinking about, okay, do we need a policy about this? What's something I could use for this? And it can spit something out really quickly. And that doesn't mean that it's good, but it means that it's at least efficient. And so you can use that to your advantage. Don't copy and paste it without proofreading it. I'll give you guys an example. I'm on the Constitution Committee for my district here in South Wisconsin, which means we review church constitutions anytime they make changes. And those changes have to be approved by our committee, and then our committee takes them to the board of directors, and then the board of directors approves them. In Wisconsin, you as a church legally have to operate under the rules set out in your constitution. And you can't just change it and then operate under that new rule. It has to go through that process first. And your school's the same way. If you ever go to court, they're going to look at what does your policy manual say? What does your handbook say? What do all those things say? Not when you changed it after this happened. What did they say at the time that we're talking about? And this church had not allowed women to vote, pretty common for our churches back in the day. And so they said, okay, we want women to vote. Well, they wrote it in such a way where now only women could vote.
Huh.
So the committee noticed and we're like, we don't think you intended it this way. Why don't you guys take another proofread crack at it and then send it back to us? So if you have policy, make sure you proofread it. Make sure you have a couple people proofread it. Make sure it's actually buttoned up and clear. And that's where the review comes in, because you go, okay, did we mean it this way? No, I don't think we did. Or, oh, yeah, we did. Here's why. But you can at least make sure that that's clear. One of the other resources that will be really helpful is every state probably has a private school or religious law group of some kind. In Wisconsin, we have WIL, the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty, and they work closely with School Choice Wisconsin on different policies and things for schools. So private and parochial schools have a resource there. And that doesn't mean that lawyers are going to give you like this great shield that no one can ever encroach on, because lawyers will say, especially if you're calling for things, this is not legal advice, by the way. I'm not giving you legal advice. I'm not representing you in a court of law. That's Rob talking. So do not stand in front of a judge and be like, well, Rob said I have this podcast episode. No, not saying that. But they can look at things and they can at least give you sample policies and they can talk through some of those things with you. The reality of it is you can have a great policy and it will, if you ever need to use it, and let's say you get sued for something and they say, show us your policy on this. Did you handle everything the way your policy said? This is usually around either staffing, hiring and firing, or maybe student discipline. These are probably the biggest issues where you could have somebody say, hey, we're suing for whatever. And they're going to say, show us your policy. And you could have a policy that went through a legal team and got approved and everybody proofread it, but it's going to come down to whatever that judge says, basically, if it's a jury trial or maybe it's just a judge trial. And they'll say, would a reasonable person in this situation do this? Did you follow your policy, yes or no? And sometimes you can follow policy and they can say, okay, that's what your policy says, but it's not reasonable. And so you could lose that case. That's possible. And none of our schools ever want to be in that situation. I pray to the Lord that I am never listed individually in a lawsuit ever in my life. I think court is interesting, but I never want to see the inside of one. So I want to make sure that I have good policies and that I'm doing everything the right way. And every once in a while, you just need a sanity check. So a lot of our states are banning cell phones, and a lot of our schools are banning cell phones. And there's a school that their policy is if you have a cell phone, you are suspended on the spot. You have a cell phone on you for any reason, you are suspended. Is that reasonable? I think probably, right? Now, if they'd gone more extreme than that, hey, you're expelled on the spot for having a cell phone. Is that reasonable? I think you probably make an argument one way or the other, right? Some of those things are going to fall into that category. Some things maybe won't. There's a school district in Texas right now that is being sued over their policy about hair. They had a student who had dreadlocks and his hair was touching his collar, and they kicked him out. Where they had another student, didn't have dreadlocks, his hair was also touching his collar, didn't get kicked out. So they're going to court. I don't think they're going to win because they did not apply their policy fairly and equally. That's the other thing you got to do. If you have policy, you have to use it all the time, even when you don't want to. It's not just something you use when you feel like it. It is an all the time, every time thing. So keep that in mind as you're making these. Do you want to follow through on it with everybody? And if you don't, then it probably shouldn't be a policy at all.
That's a really important point, Rob. I love how you said that. It has to be fairly applied. Absolutely. And And I even love the question that you asked at the end there. Would you want to apply this in all situations? Because there might be times when you don't. You're like, well, maybe this situation this would work, but others it wouldn't. Rework it and keep reworking it. And again, make your own litmus test. If this happens, would the policy cover it? And I would encourage you to even be creative and maybe a bit ridiculous in some of the things that you're like, would it cover for this? Because this whole thing of, well, nothing shocks me anymore. No, I'm still shocked every day. I'm in year 17 as a principal and things still shock me. So you have to think sometimes, go outside the box and, well, that would never happen. Don't say that. That's bad. Those are bad words. The other thing that you can do, and Rob touched on this a little bit, is talking about basically having your policy manual vetted by lawyers. Now, I used to think, well, I don't know any lawyers, and lawyers cost a lot of money, and how am I going to get legal advice? I think we're probably good. But it's come to me, there's a couple different opportunities that you might have to get your policy manual to go through legal review. And again, a legal review is not a silver bullet. So I'm not saying if you do this, you are immune from anything because it's legally vetted. That's not the case. But it really helps. And I think that is kind of the next above and beyond approach, because you are demonstrating that you're doing everything possible to make sure that your policies are reasonable, that they can be applied fairly and equitably. Two resources that I would encourage you to look into. First is your own insurance company. I know the last school I was principal, we had an insurance company that actually offered that as part of our insurance package. They had their own legal team, and we just sent them our policy manual, and they basically said, yeah, it passes the sniff test, except here, here, and here, you might want to consider making these tweaks. And it was then in our court. They're not going to come after me and say, did you do it? But of course we did, because it made sound sense. The other one is for Lutheran Church, Missouri Synod Schools, LCMS schools, there is something called the Lutheran Legal League. If you haven't heard of it, Google it. It's kind of cool. This is a group of lawyers throughout the U.S., people who are church members in a Lutheran church that are lawyers that have said, hey, I'll give schools advice. I'll help schools out. And you can actually go onto their website and click on your state, and you'll see if there's lawyers in your state that are part of the Lutheran Legal League. And you might be surprised who you find. But I've used them recently. We developed a new policy, and it had the potential to be contentious. So we sent it to them. I got some great advice, and we're moving forward feeling confident, like, okay, I think that passed every single sniff test that we had. So there are some options out there that hopefully are going to be helpful to you as you figure out all the policy and all the things you got to do.
Yeah, that policy. I think if you really enjoy this conversation, you've probably been in the edge of your seat this whole time because you love policy. And if policy is your least favorite thing, maybe you fast forwarded to the end already. Who knows?
Let's just go to the prayer.
Well, I think the last thing we should cover is there a list of policies you should have that is all encompassing? And the answer is no, there's not. There's not a list of everything you should have. I think there are basics. You should have policies around anything where somebody could get in trouble for it, money, uh, building policy, all those big things. But then all the other stuff, you're going to have to find out what works for your environment, because not every policy is going to apply to everybody. I think of some of our schools that are out in way rural areas. Do you have a policy on animal control? Bears, coyotes, moose, whatever it is, right? Do you have some of those things? And maybe it's so high level and happens so frequently that you go, okay, this is our policy. We do it every time. We call animal control. We notify parents. We do this. Maybe it's like a procedure. Notify the assistant principal. Hey, we found a squirrel on the playground and the kids are freaking out, whatever it is. But we can't tell you what policies to have. And so if you're looking for that, well, you're not going to get it on this episode. If you have questions about it, you can always email Mike and I. You can always call us. We're more than willing to talk through some of that and offer guidance, not legal advice,
Nope.
but guidance at least.
Yeah, exactly. And a jumping off point for you could potentially be your accrediting agency. So you could start there, because I know in NLSA, for example, there are a few things that the school has a policy on XYZ. Not a ton. It's more of the school has a policy manual, but you can read through that. Or if you're a Cognia accredited school or whatever your local state accreditation agency is, maybe take a look there, because that would potentially give you some ideas on what you might want to develop. But like Rob said, that's not going to be an exhaustive list. And there is no exhaustive list because it's contextualized. You're absolutely right. So anyways, that's kind of just a little flavor of policy. Probably, like Rob said, not the most riveting topic, but at the same time, I think it's a topic that can't be overlooked because it's really important when it comes down to it that we have taken care of the families that God has placed in our school, and policy is really a tool that we can use to do that. So I think I'll end us off with a word of prayer and we'll go on our day.
Sounds great.
Heavenly Father, thank you so much for the message that you've given us to share. We thank you for the gift of Jesus, a gift that we get to celebrate every single day. And you've given us schools, Lord, where people come. In many cases, they pay to come to hear about your saving love. And we have kids in seats and families and parents and all those in our community to whom we minister. And we ask that you would continue to protect us as we fulfill the calls that we've been given. We know that Satan likes to throw his arrows our way, and we also know that we live in a very sin-sick world. But you are stronger than all of that. You've conquered sin, death, and the devil, and so we are equipped, we are empowered to move forward with the message of the gospel. I pray that you would be with administrators in schools as they seek to set policy, that you would give us wisdom as we do that, and that ultimately at the end of the day, you would protect us from whatever might come our way so that we can continue to thrive, knowing that whatever happens, we are safe in you. We ask that you would bless all of those who lead, all who serve, and all who learn. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.